really excited to have this event tonight, especially because we have an unprecedented number of people attending online. So to those of you that are joining us online, welcome. We'll explain in a little bit, but during the Q&A after Professor Chen's lecture, we will be encouraging you to submit your questions as well. So we'll talk about that in a second. The Silha Center was established quite a while ago with generous grants from Helen and Otto Silha. And tonight we have with us one of the Silha daughters, Alice Ryman, and her husband, John. So are you here somewhere so you can wave, stand up? There they go. So thank you to them. And I believe one of their the other son, Stephen Silha, and his partner Gordon are joining us online as well. The Silha Center is the center of the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communications work in media law and media ethics. We have multiple events throughout the year. This fall we'll have our annual Silha lecture. Don't have a date yet, don't have a topic yet, but we know we're not going to run out of any ideas for interesting things to hopefully bring you together to have some interesting and provocative ideas. But although many times the Silha lecture focuses on law, we do like to remember that ethics is very important as well, and in fact was very near and dear to Otto Silha's heart. So that's the topic tonight, but it's going to be kind of a hybrid topic because Professor Chen will be touching not only on law and media ethics, but also legal ethics. So we have lots of things to talk about tonight. Before I introduce him, I want to give a moment for our co-sponsors to say a couple of words. We have with us the director of the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication, Alicia Cohen.
Welcome, everyone, and welcome to everyone online. We're delighted to host you all here today. I couldn't think about a more important ethical topic, looking into data and investigative reporting, given the role of journalism in our democracy and the questions that we have now around data practices as well as journalism ethics in these times. So thank you, Jane, for being our host, and thank you to our staff, Elaine, for arranging this tonight. And I look forward to the Q&A time when we'll all have some time to ask questions of our speaker as well. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you. Also co-sponsoring the Minnesota Journalism Center, newly revived, newly revitalized, and expanded under the direction of Ben Toff.
Thank you, Jane. It's great to be here. Just wanted to introduce the Minnesota Journalism Center to those of you who don't know about us. As Jane said, we relaunched just earlier this fall. We're doing a number of different initiatives on the educational side in terms of involving our students in different programs outside the classroom in journalism education. In terms of outreach and engagement through both events and trainings and other kinds of initiatives along those lines. I wanted to mention an event that we're hosting next week around coverage of health and health equity and public health in local journalism. There is, those of you who are here in person, there are some flyers out on the front table by the books. And you can also, and there's a QR code on there that you can get some more information about the event, but you can also go to mjc.umn.edu to the Minnesota Journalism website for info about that event. And then lastly, we also do a number of research initiatives, which is a lot of my focus in terms of working with news organizations to figure out ways that they can build trust or engage with news avoiders, which is a big focus of my research. But we're just thrilled to be here and partnering with the Silha Center and excited to hear the talk. Thank you.
Thanks. And third, last but not least, Kirsten Swanson, who is the president of the Minnesota Pro chapter of SPJ, which is also co-sponsoring this event.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. And our members are, I think some of them tapped in online here. Thank you so much. We're happy to co-sponsor. Again, my name is Kristen Swanson. I am an investigative reporter here at KSTP in Minneapolis, but also serve as the president of the Minnesota chapter of Society of Professional Journalists this year. If you're unfamiliar with us, we are a local organization of National SPJ that supports local journalists by providing professional development opportunities and also outreach to the public, educating the public on how important the First Amendment is and press freedoms in our democracy. We have several events actually coming up. Most importantly, a couple deadline things here for the journalists that are watching or in the room here is our Page One events, or our Page One Awards rather, our annual awards recognizing excellent journalism from 2024. The deadline for those awards is this coming Friday, February 28th. This year, we also have introduced a new contest, the A-Mark Prize for Investigative Journalism in Minnesota, that seeks to recognize incredible accountability journalism from the previous year. And we're doing that by offering cash prizes of up to $15,000 for journalists here in Minnesota. So that deadline is also on Friday. If you have want more information, feel free to find me after the forum here, or go to our website at mnspj.org. Again, thanks, Jen.
Thank you. So, we wanted this to be a broadly cooperative event because we think the topic is so important. Today we were talking a lot about truth as well as values in journalism and in society in general. And I think it's fair to say that the whole issue of how the press interacts with the truth these days is right at center stage. There was a hearing on February 12th before the House Judiciary Committee, and Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland talked about what he characterized as the free speech emergency in our country. And I'm going to quote briefly from him. He said, "One thing that struck me was the fundamental agnosticism that I hear from a lot of my colleagues about whether something called the truth even exists anymore. We are the products of an Enlightenment constitution by people who really believed in the idea of facts and empirical investigation, and in fact our entire judicial system is based on that idea. When people go to testify in court, they swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Our judicial system is based on the idea that there is a truth. Our democratic system is based on the idea that there is a truth. But now it seems that there are those who want to establish the right to tell lies." Committee Chairman Jim Gordon made a big point of asking one journalist whether the First Amendment protects the right to lie, and he replied yes. Though I think the more accurate answer would be sometimes, since the First Amendment doesn't excuse things like false advertising, fraud, hoaxes, perjury, or plagiarism. But what we seem to be facing today is the idea that free speech does allow you to lie. The question is, in the context of journalism, where one is lying to get to the truth, is a thorny, difficult problem. Over-reliance on undercover operations that involve sting operations and subterfuge can weaken the public's trust in the media and compromise journalists' claim to be truth tellers. Undercover reporting, on the other hand, can be a very powerful tool, and I know our speaker tonight will give us some really excellent examples of that. But it's one thing to use it cautiously, only against the most important targets, and even then only accompanied by solid traditional reporting, and another thing entirely when it is done to get clicks or to change the narrative. So tonight, our speaker is going to talk about all of these things. And after he's given his formal remarks, we're going to have a little conversation here at the front of the stage, and hopefully have all of you, both online and in person, engage with us in that discussion. To briefly introduce our speaker, Professor Alan Chen is the Thompson G. Marsh Law Alumni Professor at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. One of the reasons I chose him tonight is because he's the co-author of Truth and Transparency, Undercover Investigations in the 21st Century. This book won an award at the AJMC, Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication, James A. Tankard Jr. Book Award in 2024 as the most outstanding book in the field of journalism and communication. The New York Review of Books called it the definitive work on this subject and a powerful source for lawyers. In addition to writing books, Professor Chen has written many scholarly articles as well as other books and has appeared in many venues. He's a former ACLU staff attorney and, as I said, has been teaching at the Sturm College of Law for quite a number of years now. He also actively litigates cases in federal courts around the country, challenging many restrictions on freedom of speech. The thing that brought the two of us together, and we collaborated on some briefs, involved the so-called ag-gag laws, agricultural gagging laws, which are designed to criminalize unauthorized investigations of agricultural facilities to expose inhumane or illegal practices. So with that, I will turn the podium over to Alan, Professor Chen.
Good evening. I'm really delighted to be here. I just want to first say my thanks also to Jane, the wonderful Jane Kirtley. You don't know how good you guys have it here in Minnesota. She's just an amazing national and internationally known figure in the world of the freedom of the press and media. And she's been a strong ally in many really important, seriously important causes around the country. I want to also thank all the sponsors for tonight's presentation for your generosity, and to all of you who have come to spend some time with me this evening. At a time when it seems like, to understate things, the world seems a little bit turbulent. So, and because of that, it's as important a time as any to talk about journalism and the importance of solid journalistic efforts on the part of reporters, professional journalists, and as I'll talk to you a little bit more about today, not even just journalists. So I'm gonna move this over here where my notes are. All right, I'm here this evening to talk to you about, as Jane said, undercover investigations. These investigations have taken place since before the Civil War and have resulted in many path-breaking news stories. At the same time, the use of undercover investigations, as we'll talk about, is highly controversial and has generated a great deal of discussion concerning journalistic ethics and legality. Let's begin with a few prominent examples from the world of journalism, and then we'll move on from there. In the late 19th century, a time when it was challenging for women to break into serious journalism, Elizabeth Cochran, who went by the pen name Nellie Bly, undertook what would become one of the highest profile undercover investigations the country had ever witnessed. Bly had previously worked for the Pittsburgh Dispatch, but there was assigned to write mostly columns focused on what the paper viewed as women's issues. So she set her sights on New York City and eventually obtained her dream job with the New York World, which had recently been bought by a man named Joseph Pulitzer. In 1887, her editors assigned her to go undercover as a detainee at what was then known as Blackwell's Island Insane Asylum for Women. She feigned mental illness and spent 10 days at Blackwell's, where she discovered deplorably unsafe and unsanitary conditions for the women residents and an abusive and violent staff. The New York World then published her lengthy expose about the conditions, calling public attention to the institution's serious flaws. This put Bly on the journalistic map, and she went on to write stories based on numerous undercover investigations over the course of her career, posing as a lobbyist, a detainee at a local jail, a dancer, and a buyer of babies on the black market, among many other undercover roles that she played, just to name a few. Nearly 20 years later, Upton Sinclair used deception to gain access to Chicago's meatpacking industry to gather material for what would become his novel, The Jungle. Through his writing, he exposed horrific food sanitation concerns as well as poor treatment for workers in what was then the nation's largest commercial industry. He's a little bit of a forebearer to the ag-gag investigators. Historians and biographers disagree about whether Sinclair affirmatively lied to gain access to the meatpacking yards, but it is undisputed that he dressed up as a meatpacking worker and carried around a lunch pail during his investigation to evade detection by the employers. Hidden cameras did not yet exist, of course, so Sinclair rushed back to his rented room at the end of each day and scrawled down his notes about his observations, the notes that would eventually be the basis of the jungle. In the 1970s, the Chicago Sun-Times reporters Zay Smith and Pam Zeckman, working with a local good government group, built up one of the most elaborate undercover facades ever when they opened and operated the Mirage Tavern in Chicago. After a lengthy investigation, including the use of hidden cameras, they documented high levels of corruption among Chicago's health inspectors, who frequently took bribes in exchange for looking the other way when they found code violations. The Mirage investigation, which was reported in a 25-part series in the Sun-Times, not only informed the public about the conduct of its officials, but also led to multiple criminal indictments and key statutory reforms. A nominating jury that year selected the Mirage stories as a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, but the Pulitzer Advisory Board voted to give it to another finalist. The majority of board members questioned the methods and the ethics of the elaborate subterfuge at the center of the Sun-Times investigation. So while they got this incredible story, they lost the journalistic prize. In 1992, the ABC News magazine Primetime Live conducted an undercover investigation of 3 branches of the Food Lion grocery store chain. 2 producers obtained jobs at Food Lion stores and wore hidden cameras. Their investigation revealed serious sanitation and misbranding problems with the staff's handling and packaging of food. The resulting story was nationally televised and made a big news splash, but later led to costly and time-consuming litigation against ABC and its producers. In one of my published papers, I've argued that although the litigation in the Food Lion case resulted in minimal monetary damages against ABC, it continues to serve as a significant deterrent to undercover work by journalists nearly a generation later. At this point, I think I want to pause and talk about what I mean by undercover investigations in my scholarly work, and so that we're all on the same page. I think it's probably safe to say that by this point in its evolution, most people have a general idea what we're talking about when we talk about undercover investigations. But let's talk about it in a little bit more detail. Undercover investigations typically share the following features, as I define them. First, they involve the use of deception or lies about the investigator's identity, background, their employer, and their investigative motives. Second, they use that deception to gain access to private property, people, and information and transactions that they would otherwise not be accessible to them. The investigations are intended to reveal unlawful, unethical, immoral conduct, or other information of profound public concern. In other words, newsworthy information in the journalism world. Fourth, the documentation of information obtained usually is often done through the use of hidden digital recording media. And finally, maybe obviously, the investigative target, that is the target of these investigations, desperately seeks to keep the information that is being reported on from public scrutiny. Although undercover investigations are closely associated with professional journalism, I think it's important to situate the work of professional journalists among other professionals and other people who use the same tactics, which raise interesting comparative ethical and legal questions. Civil rights testing is a long-standing practice used by fair housing groups and government investigators to identify race discrimination in housing. Typically, an investigating group will send paired testers, a white couple and a black couple, representing that they wish to buy or rent the same property. If the realtor or landlord tells the white couple that there are available listings, but the black couple that nothing is available, a violation of fair housing laws has been detected. paired testers are armed with, so to compare them with undercover investigators in journalism, paired testers are armed with false names, fictional addresses, fake employment and credit histories, and other misinformation, so that other than their race, they would be objectively viewed as comparable renters or house buyers, in order to make sure that the reason that they're being told there's nothing available is their race. Many civil rights testers also use secret recording equipment to document the discrimination, which is later used in court proceedings against the realtors or landlords. The U.S. Supreme Court has acknowledged testing as a legitimate form of civil rights enforcement, and it is now widely used to detect other forms of discrimination as well. Unions sometimes send employees or volunteer activists to get jobs at non-union workplaces with a specific purpose of organizing the workers to form a union. These workers are known as SALTs, and they are allowed to falsify their employment applications, to omit information about their work histories, their union affiliations, and their organizing objectives. Though their purpose is to organize workers, and they do so, SALTs are also obligated under the law to perform their job duties competently. Salting has been recognized as a lawful organizing tactic by the National Labor Relations Board and the U.S. Supreme Court. Law enforcement officers have long used undercover investigations to detect crime. Like other undercover investigators, they use deception to gain access to private property and conversations and transactions that they would otherwise be unable to observe. To be sure, undercover law enforcement work is more controversial than civil rights testing or even union salting. There are strong reasons to be more skeptical about government officials lying to us than other private citizens. But notwithstanding these objections, the Supreme Court has fully embraced the practice and legality of undercover police investigations. So these are three different contexts in which not only undercover investigations are used on a routine basis, but they are approved as lawful as opposed to the subject of criminal or civil sanctions. Finally, political activists. Much more controversial but no less impactful has been the adoption of undercover investigations by political activists on both the left and the right. Beginning in the mid-2000s, animal rights organizations like PETA and the Animal Legal Defense Fund began sending undercover investigators to work at mass farmed animal feeding facilities to document the horrific conditions of animal abuse. Not surprisingly, like Upton Sinclair, while they went in with one goal, they also discovered terrible conditions for workers in that industry. At the other end of the political spectrum, the Center for Medical Progress and other anti-abortion organizations have used undercover tactics to expose what they allege to be illegal conduct on the part of reproductive health organizations like Planned Parenthood. Also on the right, you have no doubt heard of the activities of James O'Keefe, the founder of Project Veritas, to uncover alleged misconduct by liberal politicians and interest groups. This is my favorite slide. Undercover, maybe it's just me, but I see undercover investigations everywhere now, even in popular culture. So I don't know if anybody here has seen the new Netflix series Man on the Inside, starring Ted Danson, where he goes undercover to investigate a theft at a senior living facility. While that's a fictionalized series, it's actually based on a real life story and a real life documentary called The Mole Agent, which is a Chilean documentary, a little bit less well made for TV because that investigator, who is also a senior citizen, went undercover at a senior living facility to identify abuse of the residents. And that was the subject of the Mole Agent, the documentary, which, and I know Jane will be keen on this, was nominated in 2020 for the Best Documentary Feature at the 2020 Academy Awards. Okay. As I alluded to earlier, the origin of undercover investigations appears to have been with Northern journalists investigating and reporting about the conditions of slavery prior to the Civil War. Believing their lives to be in danger if their true identities were revealed, these intrepid reporters returned to the South to report about military activity during the actual Civil War. Given their long history and success, it's not surprising that undercover investigations have continued to be a tactic for exposing corruption and discovering violations of the law, of moral standards, and uncovering other newsworthy information. Lies and deception in most contexts, however, are bad. They undermine truth. Paradoxically, as I have argued, and sort of the title of this evening's talk, that undercover investigations involve what I describe as high-value lies. They are lies that actually promote the values underlying the First Amendment and the freedom of the press, because they are lies that are used in the service of discovering the actual truth. And for that reason, I think that they should be treated differently, both from a legal and an ethical standpoint. So why are lies in this context, and lies to the extent that a hidden camera is also a misrepresentation, so valuable? Well, first, these types of investigations lead to the exposure of injustice and violations of law and moral and ethics. They can result in holding powerful institutions and individuals accountable for their behavior. They can inform public discourse and decision-making, one of the central goals of the freedom of the press and the freedom of speech. They may lead to legal and social reform. One of the best things about undercover investigations is calling to the attention of public officials and the general public themselves social problems and things that have been hidden beneath the surface. And these undercover investigations bring to light information, most importantly, that cannot be obtained through other more conventional news gathering methods. Now, that's the positive side of the story, but as Jane suggested, this is a very complicated legal and ethical question. Not surprisingly, there are many people who argue that the types of lies and hidden camera and hidden recordings that are used by undercover investigators are both legally problematic and ethically problematic. Many of these criticisms, I will point out, happen to come from the people whose information was exposed as a result of an undercover investigation. So there is a little bit of a self-interest in this as well. Before we turn to our focus to ethics, which is the main thing I want to talk about this evening, I want to talk a little bit about the legal barriers to undercover investigations. And of course, there's an overlap. Many of the legal barriers are also coincide with the ethical concerns. But I'm going to map out some of the legal claims that opponents of undercover investigations have used, both in terms of lobbying legislatures and in terms of the court battles that I've been involved in. So first, some opponents of undercover investigations basically say this is tantamount to fraud. Why should we treat this any differently from a common criminal? One difficulty with that theory is that fraud law typically requires that the victim show that they have suffered financial damages from the lie. This is easy in most cases, since fraud usually results in securing money from the victim. But here the investigator's lie leads only to them getting access to information. Now we'll talk in a few minutes, I'm going to talk about the other aspect of that damage that these opponents often claim that doesn't actually work as a legal theory. So fraud is pretty much, I think, off the table in most of these cases. Second, to the extent the investigations result in access to private property, they may constitute a trespass. Trespass laws impose strict liability. If I set one foot on your property for 1 second without your consent, I have committed a legal trespass. It doesn't matter whether I caused any actual harm or damage or destroyed even a single blade of grass on your property. A second complexity of trespass law is that consent is a defense to trespass. And so when the target of an investigation invites an undercover investigator onto their property, they have given their consent to somebody, even if they don't know the identity of that person or what their actual goals are. In some, but not all, state law jurisdictions, if consent is secured by deception, it is invalid and therefore does not serve as a defense to a trespass claim. Trespass is, interestingly enough, as we'll talk about, one of the primary bases of the ag-gag laws that I'm going to discuss in a few minutes. Third, some argue that undercover investigations are an invasion of privacy, both to the principal target of the investigation, which may be a business entity, and to its employees or workers. Even if we can see there's less privacy in the workplace than in private spaces, when investigators talk to and secretly record these employees, those employees may in retrospect feel betrayed and feel that their trust has been violated. In my conversations with people who have conducted undercover investigations, I have observed some ambivalence about the impact that their investigations have had on the people who were, after all, during their time in the investigation, their fellow coworkers. So that's something that investigators are quite aware of, even as they're doing this important journalistic work. Many undercover investigations are conducted by the investigator seeking employment with the target of the investigation. So these are, in many contexts, employment-based investigations are the only realistic way to get information, because only employees can gain access to the places and conversations and information that a company is sometimes trying to hide. Some employers have argued that when investigators do this, they obtain a job through false pretenses. They violate what is known as the common law duty of loyalty, because the investigator is working both for the target of the investigation and from the organization that is sponsoring the investigation itself. In somewhat anachronistic biblical terms, the duty of loyalty prevents the same person from, quote, serving two masters. Okay, so those are the primary legal theories. We can talk about more of those in greater detail if you want during the Q&A. But it's worth noting here quickly, and this is something that I've argued in much of my scholarly work, that what's missing here? What is the most common law tort or tool that targets of journalistic stories use to retaliate against reporters? It's defamation law, right? As many of you are well familiar with. Why is defamation not on the table when it comes to undercover investigations? Well, assuming the information discovered during an undercover investigation is truthful and accurate, right? And it is frequently proven to be so by being captured on video, defamation cannot be used as a way to attack the story, because, as you all know, truth is a complete defense to a defamation claim. So I've argued in some of my work that some of these legal theories, some of which are plausible, some of which I think are more contrived, are really an end run around the fact that these companies can't use defamation law to retaliate against journalists and others who embarrass them by exposing information that was supposed to be hidden from the public. Now, I should note here, while talking about defamation, that some of the conservative groups who have heavily used undercover investigations have been accused of altering the videos they have produced or editing them and publicly displaying them out of context to misrepresent what has occurred. That's a serious concern. But I'm going to bracket those concerns here and limit our discussion to investigations that result in accurately reported stories. But again, we can pick that up in the Q&A. It's been my assertion, in addition to the issue about defamation, that many of these legal arguments are really are the types of claims that wouldn't lead to substantial damages awards, right? Defamation claims can lead to multi-million-dollar damage awards or settlements and extremely high litigation costs. What is the damage for a trespass or a minor invasion of privacy because somebody had a conversation with somebody they didn't know who they were at work? But targets of these undercover investigations have nonetheless used these legal claims for two main reasons. First, there's always the chance that even if they win only a small or nominal damages claim for trespass against an undercover investigator, they might also get a large punitive damages claim. And the reason for that is undercover investigations are undertaken intentionally and knowingly. And so that mental state or mens rea standard puts at risk these types of investigators to large punitive damage claims, even if they might not be awarded large compensatory damages claims. Before it was overturned by the courts, the jury in the Food Lion case, for example, imposed a $5.5 million punitive damages claim against ABC and its reporters. So there's the punitive damage problem. Second, targets of undercover investigations have also tried to use these legal theories to shoehorn in a claim for what are known as publication damages. They've argued that the damage caused by an undercover investigation isn't really the property or privacy violation that occurs when the investigator enters that person's property, but the resulting news story that is produced and published because of the investigation. But here there are pretty strong claims that publication damages in this context would violate the First Amendment. Ultimately, I argue that both of these, or all of these claims really seem to be an attempt to circumvent the limitations on defamation law by attempting a legal theory that would impose significant legal liability for publication of truthful information, which is again not permissible under defamation, common law defamation. Okay. Finally, the activities in the legal front, the activities undertaken by undercover investigators may violate some criminal laws. In response to the animal rights investigations I mentioned, many larger farming states have adopted laws at the behest of the animal agricultural industry that make the types of activities used by investigators a violation of state criminal law. These so-called ag-gag laws typically outlaw using deception to gain access to or employment at an agricultural facility. They also frequently make it a crime to record the activities at an animal agricultural facility without the consent of the owner. These laws have been the subject of much controversy and litigation in federal courts around the country, which in full disclosure, as Jane mentioned, I have been actively involved in. The decisions thus far have been mixed. The 4th, 9th, and 10th Circuit Federal Courts of Appeal have declared the ag-gag laws of North Carolina, Idaho, and Kansas to be unconstitutional. Well, the 8th Circuit, where we are tonight, has upheld the ag-gag law, the Iowa ag-gag law, against a First Amendment challenge. So what is the legal theory about how ag-gag laws might violate the First Amendment rights of investigators? And would those same theories could those same theories be used to defend journalists and others who undertake undercover investigations? Well, the initial part of the legal theory here is that the First Amendment has been held to protect the production and creation of speech, as well as its communication to others. In other words, news gathering in some forms. Although the Supreme Court has not recognized a First Amendment privilege for journalists to engage in news gathering that would exempt them from the enforcement of these types of laws, it has recognized that there is some abstract sort of First Amendment protection for news gatherers at some level. So we start with that, the basis, that sort of premise. Next, in United States versus Alvarez, Jane mentioned, well, what do we do about lies? When are lies protected by the First Amendment and when are they not? Well, the Supreme Court held in the Alvarez case that the First Amendment generally protects even false statements of fact from government punishment unless those false statements of fact or those lies cause a legally cognizable harm or produce a material gain for the liar. So this is why the discussion of the common law actions against undercover investigators are so important, because the states in these cases have argued, well, trespass is a legally cognizable harm, even if it doesn't actually cause any monetary or financial damage. If that's the case, if that is how Alvarez is interpreted, then we're going to lose these ag-gag cases. But if, as we argued, there are other considerations here, and that these laws are really targeted toward a specific viewpoint or act of animal rights activists, then the First Amendment claims become stronger. Ultimately, at issue in the ag-gag litigation is whether there should be a limited First Amendment privilege protecting both the deception necessary to undercover investigations and the use of electronic recording equipment to document those investigations. I've elaborated on those arguments in much of my published work, and I'm happy to talk about the ag-gag laws in more detail or about my legal theories later in the Q&A. Okay, so that's the legal landscape, and again, obviously, the violations of law can also be phrased or framed as ethical violations as well. But let us turn to the main topic of today's lecture, which is the ethics of undercover investigations, both in terms of legal ethics and media ethics. I'll begin with more general ethics claims against undercover investigations or concerns about undercover investigations, and then place some of the questions in more specific context for the purposes of the Q&A and for discussion. Okay. The first and probably most prominent ethical claim against undercover investigations is a normative argument that all lying is unethical without regard to the context or the reason. This absolutist position is most closely associated with the German Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant famously argued that lying is always wrong because it deprives the listener of their human autonomy while serving the benefits of the speaker or the liar. In Kant's view, no instrumental or even moral justification can outweigh the moral wrong of lying. Needless to say, I think we can place Kant in the camp of those who would oppose undercover investigations, because there's no justification that would convince him that a lie was permissible, or ethically permissible, or morally permissible. Second, the claim that undercover investigations violate core journalistic values of truthfulness and transparency, something that Jane mentioned in her introduction. For a journalist to compromise those values is to turn her back on the profession itself. It's hypocritical. In the law of equity, we would call this the problem of unclean hands. You can't make a claim against somebody else if you yourself have committed a wrong. A vocal opponent of undercover tactics, Howard Kurtz, who's formerly the Washington Post media critic and now a host on the Fox News cable channel, articulates this criticism here. In Kurtz's view, no matter how good the story, lying to get it raises as many questions about journalists as their subjects. Essentially, he's arguing that undercover tactics violate or should violate the ethical standards of professional journalism, and therefore should never be undertaken. To give equal time to the target of Kurtz's criticism, this is a quote from Ken Silverstein, who at that time had recently published an undercover story based on an undercover investigation he did in Harper's. Silverstein replies to Kurtz, "The carping from the Washington press corps is hard to stomach. As a class, they honor politeness over honesty and believe that being balanced means giving the same weight to a lie as you give to the truth. I'll take Nellie Bly any day." So, okay. A related ethical criticism, although one perhaps more grounded in professional concerns than solely ethical ones, is that undercover investigations undermine public trust and credibility in journalism. The central idea here is that the loss of public trust effectively discredits the profession as a whole. If people know the press lies to get stories, how can they trust anything that the press writes? And finally, another ethical critique of undercover investigations is that they're not driven by journalists' desire to investigate and report the news, but to sell newspapers and television ad time. That is, they are nothing but sensationalist and exploitive forms of infotainment rather than hard-hitting journalism. This is one of the most common critiques that I've confronted in my work. Interestingly, this was a common critique of the media during the late 20th century, when the major television networks began to expand the vehicle of the television news magazine, and shows like 60 Minutes, Dateline, and Primetime Live became very popular. It was quite common for somebody whose illegalities or unethical behavior was exposed by a 60 Minutes undercover investigation to go into the press themselves and defend their honor, but not because they didn't do what 60 Minutes showed what they did, but because 60 Minutes was just trying to sell potato chips, basically ad time. But interestingly enough, as in my research, as I sort of got into this further, you could find an analogous criticism leveled at print journalists all the way back in Nellie Bly's day. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, when undercover investigations by print journalists were becoming more common, critics used all sorts of pejorative terms to attack the practice. Undercover journalists were accused of stunt or detective journalism, forebears of the modern insult gotcha journalism. Similarly, it's often forgotten that when Teddy Roosevelt first coined the term muckrakers, he actually meant it as an insult. On this point, as I write in my book, and this is again about the late 1800s, these disparaging names were meant to attack the reporters' credibility by suggesting both that they were driven by their newspaper's profit motives and that their sensationalistic nature was distinguishable from legitimate forms of journalistic reporting. This may have led some to be more dismissive about the fact that some of their investigations revealed serious information that would otherwise have been hidden from public view. In addition, and nobody's really written about this, because many of these journalists were women emerging in a field previously dominated by men, there may have been a significant gendered component to these disparagements. So, the hysterical women journalists are doing these unethical undercover investigations. They can't do the real hard news reporting that men are doing. When you read these criticisms from that era, you really get the strong sense that there is a gender component. To perhaps illustrate a modern equivalent to stunt journalism or these other insults, state legislators supporting and justifying the enactment of ag laws that we talked about have been recorded in the legislative history in those states as calling undercover animal rights investigators jackwagons, which was a term that was new to me, marauding invaders, and radical vegans. Those are the biggest insults that they could come up with. Okay, so what do we do about this? We have the journalistic and public information benefits of undercover investigations, and we have both legal and ethical concerns that are legitimate. I don't dismiss them at all. So how do we get around this? When and whether are undercover investigations ever permissible? Well, both in my book and my other published work, I have argued for a utilitarian approach to considering the ethics of undercover investigations. The view that the morally right action is the action that produces the most good, the net most good. That is, I argue that the greater public good of providing the public with information that promotes public discourse and transparency outweigh, in most cases, any sort of autonomy or psychic harm to the investigator's target, in most cases. I take all the ethical objections quite seriously, but argue that if particular care is taken to guard against the potential problems that we've talked about, the value of undercover investigations to an informed public and to holding powerful institutions and individuals accountable is more important than the concerns of the targets of the investigations. I also argue that the acute concerns about harms to the targets of undercover investigations are themselves often exaggerated or non-existent. Moreover, as discussed more extensively in my book, undercover investigations can even be understood to be consistent with at least two frameworks for thinking about the role of journalism and journalism ethics. First, a liberal theory framework of journalism ethics has been described as emphasizing the news media's role in our constitutional democracy as an independent institution, quote, that informs citizens and acts as a watchdog for government abuses of power. Undercover investigations are certainly consistent with liberal theory to the extent that they facilitate the media's role in informing the public and serving as watchdogs on the government and other powerful entities. Some theories of journalism ethics stress that the press should not only inform the public, but also play a role in interpreting the news to help explain complex issues to readers and explain the significance and context of events. And the theory of an activist press goes even further and suggests that part of the duty to inform includes helping the public to arm them with the information that allows them to challenge the status quo and pursue social causes and reforms. Undercover investigations seem to be consistent with the interpretation and activism frameworks. These investigations not only help inform the public, but may also inspire efforts towards social reform. Indeed, that is the goal of many undercover investigators, whether within the journalism profession or not. Of course, I can be accused of cherry-picking my journalistic theories to justify undercover investigations. Excuse me. And I am. But I think I can defend my claims here. Those of you, many of you may disagree, and I'm happy to discuss that. I spend most of my time disagreeing with people about this topic. More specifically, I can be accused of de-emphasizing other ethical frameworks that argue that journalism should serve other critical social values that are not consistent with undercover investigations. For instance, some journalism ethicists argue that journalists should be evaluated by their objectivity and the manner in which they use their craft in socially responsible ways. And that social responsibility might include being careful about the people who are the subjects of your stories and the sources of your stories. Other frameworks consistent with that theory say that journalists should emphasize ethically greater concern about harm, the harm that's caused by but not only their writing, but by the investigations that lead them to write stories, and that they have a duty to minimize harms to their community. So one could take those legal frameworks and say, undercover investigations really don't fully consider or fully flesh out those particular interests, or at least under-consider them. Even here, however, I think we can find some room for agreement or for utilitarian arguments, because even those models do not necessarily lead to the conclusion that undercover investigations should never be undertaken, but rather require the active consideration of the types of relational harms that they might cause, and to basically, could argue they actually embrace the utilitarian calculus that I'm talking about, but they may think it's more important to consider the harm aspects than the benefits. Another response that is often leveled against the claim that I've made about supporting undercover investigations is that utilitarian claims are just too manipulable and subjective, right? I mean, someone can always make the argument that this outweighs this because they think this is more important. And I'll tell you that many of the people I talk with about this topic thinks, I agree there's a utilitarian calculus, the cost is way too high, and therefore even the benefits of undercover investigations can never outweigh that cost. And so it's obviously true that utilitarian arguments can be manipulated. And so part of my response is that, as we'll talk about, and as I've already said, I take the ethical concerns and the legal concerns quite seriously. I do not dismiss them by any measure. I fully acknowledge that all these are legitimate concerns. On the other hand, as some of the legal cases about undercover investigations have revealed, it's also quite common for those who are opposed to such undercover investigations and are the targets of unfavorable news stories to overstate the harms that they allegedly suffer from undercover investigations. So the manipulability goes both ways in terms of the utilitarian argument. And of course, the victims of these stories, or the targets of these stories, have great incentive to stop all undercover investigations because they have exposed their conduct as unlawful, unethical, or immoral. Second, I would support my claim by arguing that many of the actual professional journalism standards already incorporate a utilitarian consideration specifically under their ethical standards. These ethical standards, as I've researched them, tend to, I think, exhibit some ethical ambivalence about undercover investigations, which I think is perfectly fine. Many of these standards expressly incorporate utilitarian considerations, even though, as I will concede that such standards more strongly lean against undercover investigations than for them. The New York Times Ethical Journalism Handbook takes a pretty strong stance against undercover investigations. And this is consistent with conversations I've had with the general counsels of some major newspapers. This first standard seems pretty unambiguous, stating that journalists should never pose as police officers, lawyers, business people, or anyone else. Interestingly, I've always found this fascinating. The Times makes one exception for their reporters lying, and that is restaurant critics and theater critics. Okay. So I imagine in my head this dialogue, or this New York Times editor screaming, "We forbid Jodi Kantor to conceal her identity when investigating human trafficking, but we can't possibly risk a Michelin star restaurant finding out that Sam Sifton is dining in tonight." I feel like that's a little bit backwards in terms of like if we're going to do a utilitarian calculus. The Times also takes a pretty hard line against secret recordings, although it notes that masthead editors may make rare exceptions to this, where recordings are made in places where secret recordings are legal. Notably, nothing in the Times handbook says anything that I could find says anything about specifically addressing other types of surreptitious recording of conduct, for example, as opposed to conversations. That kind of surprises me, given their strong stance, their seemingly presumptive stance against undercover investigations. Another example of a built-in utilitarian consideration comes from PBS's Frontlines standards, which actually argue that, quote, "in some cases it may be necessary for a producer to withhold his or her identity, even though such cases are, quote, exceptional." The current version of the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics takes a slightly more ambivalent line, and I argue a little bit more supportive, suggesting that reporters should avoid undercover investigations, but implicitly permitting them to do so when traditional open methods will not yield information vital to the public. Again, building in the utilitarian calculus right into the ethical standard. And finally, in their book on investigative reporting, David Anderson and Peter Benjaminson take an overtly utilitarian line. They suggest that, quote, deceptive methods are justified only when greater harm will be done to the public if the information remains concealed than the harm done to individuals by its publication. So they fully embrace the utilitarian calculus. Okay, so those are sort of the broader general ethical claims. I'm going to check my time here. I want to quickly go through some more specific ethical questions, and then I'd like to turn it over to open to discussion. Are you doing okay on time? Okay. All right. Okay. We talked about the general ethical concerns. Now I'd like to focus more specifically on granular considerations about the ethics of undercover investigations. If you believe that undercover investigations are either always or never justified, these more nuanced questions may not be of interest to you. But I think they raise some important considerations worth discussing this evening, and I would love to hear your thoughts about them during the Q&A. So the overall arching question is, should there be any legal privilege and or ethical code exception for undercover investigations? So that's starting from the more global position. Second, if there should be any such privilege, what is the scope of that privilege? Must special circumstances be invoked to justify such an investigation, as in the SPJ standards, or can they be conducted on a routine or regular basis? Third, and this is a really interesting one given the work that I do, if there is a privilege, should it protect only news gathering by professional journalists, or could it extend to political activists, or for that matter, civil rights testers or union salts? Building even further on that, within the journalism profession, should different standards apply to print journalists than to TV journalists? This question stems from a great, unfortunately, private conversation I had with the Associate General Counsel for one of the nation's leading newspapers. When I asked him why, I asked him about the trend of newspapers moving away from undercover investigations, and he said, yeah, that we just don't allow that at this newspaper. I almost said the newspaper's name. And I said, well, what about like 60 Minutes and prime time? He goes, oh, that's TV. They're a different animal. It's suggesting that they actually follow different ethical standards. So that's something we could talk about as well tonight. Is deception by omission more ethical than affirmative deceptions or actual lies? Some media outlets actually have ethical rules that distinguish between affirmative misrepresentations, which they forbid, and omissions, which they do not forbid. That is, you don't have to correct the misimpression that you're not a journalist, but you can't say you're not a journalist. In other contexts, I've often said that's slicing the onion a little thin for my my ethical code. As another example of such ethical fine-tuning, the producer for ABC's Food Lion investigation told me that while ABC's lawyers authorized them to obtain jobs at Food Lion under false pretenses without disclosing their affiliation with ABC and to carry with them hidden video cameras while they were at work, the lawyers insisted that the producers use their real names and social security numbers. I don't know. I'm not sure where that's coming from. So, and then sort of the thing that I said earlier, are utilitarian ethics arguments too subjective and manipulable, and therefore not worthy of consideration in an ethical debate about the value and harms of undercover investigations? I was going to finish with the way that my book finishes, but I'm just going to quickly do this. So as we worked through this tome about undercover recording, we sort of, my co-author and I, Professor Marceau, thought we really wanted to give good faith value or to the ethical objections and legal objections to undercover investigations. We also tried to address the issue about, well, what do we do about non-journalists versus journalists? So the argument, I'll just preview it here, the argument for limiting any kind of privilege for undercover investigations to professional journalists is that those journalists have ethical codes that they abide by, at least that they're supposed to abide by. They have professional standards. They go to journalism school. They learn about responsible reporting, fact-checking, giving the investigative target an opportunity to comment, all these things that you're well aware of. An animal rights activist or an anti-abortion activist may not care about those things or may not comply with those things. And so in the closing the book, we said, well, what if we gave them a set of ethical principles that they should follow also? So here are the ethical principles very quickly before I close that we suggest would be a guideline for undercover investigators to follow. And while following these guidelines would not necessarily insulate any of these investigators from legal liability or ethical criticisms, following what we regard as the best practices for undercover investigations may at least help in terms of achieving both professional and public acceptance for these investigations, as well as ensuring or enhancing the credibility of the information they reveal. Following such practices may also help investigators demonstrate that they're acting in good faith to limit the potential harms or abuses that might flow from an undercover investigation. So first, we say investigators, before conducting an undercover investigation, investigators must have some specific evidence that their investigation will reveal misconduct, illegality, or wrongdoing on the part of the investigation's target. In other words, no fishing expeditions allowed. Right? You can't just go in, oh, I think they might be committing some sort of violation. Correlating to that, undercover investigations should only be conducted to gather information that is of great public concern. So no spying on your neighbor just to get their secret cookie recipe. Second, if the information sought in terms of both quantity and quality is readily available and easily obtained through other sources, those sources should be used first. One of the untold stories about the Food Lion investigation, which led to the litigation that I was talking about, is the months and months of investigative reporting those reporters did before the undercover investigation, and the 6 months of investigative reporting they did after the undercover investigation. So everybody sort of focuses on the 10 days or the few days that they worked at Food Lion undercover, and don't realize that this was a very, very professionally conducted investigation, even though Food Lion would like you to believe otherwise. Okay. Third, it's permissible to use deception, including deception by omission or affirmative misrepresentation about the investigator's identity, political affiliations, and motivations for gaining access to the investigation site. But such deception may not be used for any other purpose than gaining access to an investigation, conducting an investigation, and remaining undercover. When conducting employment-based investigations, the investigator should not exaggerate or inflate their credentials. They only may tell lies that omit their political or journalistic affiliations, understate their ability to do the job that they're applying for, or conceal their identity. Any photography or audio recording or video recording must be reproduced truthfully in reports to the public. No alterations or editing to mislead the listener or viewer are permissible. Editing for brevity, coherence, and to protect the privacy interests of those who are being recorded is permissible, but must not be done in a way that is misleading. Fifth, this should be obvious, investigators must not cause physical harm to the property or people who are being investigated. They may not engage in theft, including intellectual property theft, or cause other harms to the property or people being investigated. The investigator should not induce, solicit, or entrap others to engage in misconduct or to actively celebrate or engage in misconduct themselves. However, investigators need not report misconduct or to government officials immediately if doing so would compromise the success of the investigation. And I can talk about that in the Q&A. Finally, investigators must not deprive individuals who are associated with the investigation site of their dignity, privacy, or autonomy unless that is the direct result of those individuals' participation in the suspected misconduct being investigated. Investigations targeting highly vulnerable individuals are highly discouraged. Undercover investigations in which investigators gain access to commercial properties are preferable to investigations of private property. There's more detail to each of these considerations. When I sat down to write these best practices, I thought I didn't see myself writing an ethical code for undercover investigators, but it became a really interesting project. Okay, so undercover investigations, as I've tried to argue today, have been used in our society since the late 19th century, and they continue to be employed today, though obviously not without controversy or critique. So in conclusion, I hope that you'll read my book, which is full of extensive descriptions of a wide range of such investigations. I could really only scratch the surface in the talk tonight, and also talks in more detail about the positive effect that these investigations have had on public discourse informing political and moral debates, and provoking the consideration of social and legal reforms. They're unquestionably cost, as I've admitted, but I think if investigators treat the potential for harm seriously and act to mitigate them, this form of news gathering will and should continue forward as an important tool for the 21st century for news gatherers. Thank you for your attention. I very much look forward to your questions and comments.
So do we want them to put them in the chat or in,
He made me a host so I could see the questions. I believe they should submit it here into the question and answer.
okay,
But either
in the
one.
Q&A. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Alan. And you and I are going to have a little conversation, and we're also going to open this up to our attendees, both online and here in the audience. We've got microphones, which will be brought to you if you raise your hands to ask a question. And we invite those watching online to submit their questions to the Q&A. So if you can do that, those questions will be brought up and we'll ask them. But while you're all thinking of your questions, I wanted to raise one thing that you mentioned, which was the issue of fraud, specifically. Because I remember very well during the Food Lion case that one of the things that media lawyers were really concerned about was that companies like Food Lion were using laws of general applicability, laws that apply to everybody, but they were putting them into a journalistic context where historically they hadn't been used as a weapon against the press. As Alan said, in the case of Food Lion, they couldn't really sue for defamation because there was no evidence that Food Lion had manipulated any of the material they obtained. It was all truthful, it just was information that Food Lion didn't want to have out there. So that's why they used a variety of other traditional torts as their basis for suing Food Lion. Now we have the President of the United States suing media under a fraud theory. That's not involving undercover investigations, at least not in the sense that you're describing them, although the issue of deceptive editing has been alleged. So what's your reaction to these cases? Are they valid? Are they crazy? What's going to happen?
I think this is really no different than large corporations or men accused in the Me Too movement of using, powerful people using defamation or other tort claims as a way to retaliate against truthful stories. And I see what Trump is doing is really just borrowing from that playbook. What's fascinating about President Trump is he wants to revisit New York Times versus Sullivan, and so do Justice Thomas and I think Justice Gorsuch have suggested that they would revisit it too, making it easier to sue people in defamation, including the media. At the same time, he's been sued for defamation on numerous occasions, resulting in multi-million-dollar verdicts. So I think he actually doesn't see the paradox in that. I mean, I think the Jean Carroll verdict is a defamation verdict, right? So, and he fought that tooth and nail. So it's hard to view any of his claims about the press as anything but opportunistic. And I hate to say that because I'm sure there are people out there who believe in him ideologically or politically, but this would be I would be calling this out if a Democratic president were doing the same thing. It's just an abuse. It's almost like an abusive process. So, and I think that's what Food Lion was doing also. Yeah,
I mean, it's one thing for a multinational grocery store chain to go after ABC in this case because they're upset about the revelations of their unsanitary practices. I mean, you kind of expect them to use every tool they have in their toolbox. But, the essence of the New York Times versus Sullivan case was about powerful officials not using, in that case, defamation law to punish and silence the press because they were seen as having their own bully platform where they could correct any errors. And that was 1964. And today we have this interesting imbalance where a lot of your remarks were focused understandably on what we often call the mainstream media, but we now have this new angle of a lot of people that are sort of pseudo-journalists. It's not entirely clear whether their role is classic journalism or advocacy or misinformation or all of these things. How do you think these kinds of rules and principles are applying in this new media situation?
I think that's a great question. I've been a big advocate for a broad freedom of the press that would apply not just to professional journalists, but to others who, again, subscribe to certain ethical and standards or principles. And part of that is just a definitional one. It's really getting difficult. The legacy media has shrunk. Sadly, their local newspapers are shuttering around the country, and something's got to fill that void. And I think it can be a positive development if people with sort of good faith efforts to try to engage in journalism do so. Now, what does that mean? Can anybody be a journalist? The internet was supposed to be, I can start my own newsletter, my own blog, and suddenly I'm a journalist. Does that mean I get all the protections of the free press? But the Supreme Court, as you know, has never really recognized an independent right of freedom of the press, much to the consternation of many of us. So we're really just talking about a free speech right here, not a freedom of the press right, although we borrow some of the concepts of freedom of the press in advocating for it. I think so this is the problem. Who's going to decide who's a journalist? And this has been a problem that's frustrated a lot of us. Should the government decide what counts as a journalist? That's not going to be acceptable. The government in some ways does that already by gaining the White House press room, right? It's not an open forum. You get access to the White House press room because the White House gives you access to the White House press room. Traditionally, that has been an open to all major news outlets. Now, apparently, if you don't say Gulf of America, you're denied access to the White House press room in your news stories. So, I don't want the government making the decision what counts. I don't think I want the courts making that decision either. That's why I kind of actually am, you fall in love with your own work, but I'm more enamored of this idea of having a universal set of ethical standards that would apply to anybody who engages in news gathering, which we could also obviously fiddle with in terms of the definition. So.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that because you were talking about Project Veritas and James O'Keefe, and I remember very much that during the controversy involving not just his Acorn investigation, which many of you may remember, but the more recent issues involving Joe Biden's daughter's diary and so forth, that O'Keefe did argue that the techniques he was using were really indistinguishable from those of mainstream media. And it was fascinating watching the mainstream media try to distance itself from O'Keefe because they saw him as so ideologically driven, I think, was a lot of it. And of course, they would also say, we would never steal a diary or something like O'Keefe was alleged to have done, or O'Keefe and his staff were alleged to have done. But I do think that it becomes a much more difficult argument to draw those distinctions. And like you, I'm going to come down on the side of we need general principles that apply to everybody, and these distinctions between mainstream media, legacy media, who have been systematically delegitimized by many people, including many of the people in the White House, are going to become distinctions without a difference, I think. And truly, I think we're going to have to hang together on this, or we will be hanging separately.
Yeah.
Questions out there? Please raise your hand and they'll bring you a mic.
Thank you. This was so interesting. Sorry, that was too close to my mouth. I actually have a lot of questions, but I'm going to try to just keep it to one. Okay. So I was really interested in some of these ag rules, specifically barring recording on agricultural sites. And I'm wondering when those laws intersect with other state or federal policies around, let's say, if you're in a 1 or 2 state recording state, which one wins in that situation? Which one?
Right. So the question, because you didn't hear, is about. I didn't talk about one party or 2 party consent state. So in under every state has its own laws about secret recording. So many states are two-party states, meaning both parties to a conversation have to consent before it can be recorded. In many states, you only need the consent of one of the parties. And the question is, how does that intersect with some of the ag-gag restrictions? I think, so to the extent it's a one-party state where you could record somebody without their consent, I think these criminal laws override that. So they say, in this context, you need two-party consent, right? And the interesting thing about it is that it only targets one industry, which makes it even more like one of the ag cases we litigated was the challenge to the Kansas ag law. It went to the 10th Circuit. I argued it in the 10th Circuit. We won the case, and then Kansas asked the U.S. Supreme Court to hear the case, and we scrambled to. We actually don't know what the current court would say about this, although we have an inkling. And so we were desperately trying to get the sort of not take the case. And it was, part of it was like, how are we going to characterize, what the issues here are? And as we were preparing our brief in the Supreme Court to ask them not to take the case, a New Yorker article by Jane Meyer came out, and it reported that Ginny Thomas had been reportedly during President Trump's first term, had told somebody that what she wanted to do was take people out to lunch because she didn't think they were true believers in President Trump. And she was going to carry a secret recording device with her and catch them on tape saying bad things about President Trump. And said she was going to run to President Trump and report their disloyalty. And then we started to think, maybe we do want the Supreme Court to take the case, because maybe Justice Thomas will be on our side. But so you have strange, bedfellows in some of these issues as well. Anyway, that's a long answer to your question, but it basically imposes two-party consent. Oh, the other part of my story was we worked with a very experienced Supreme Court practitioner in this case, and we said, what do you think of our legal theory? Which is, I would say innovative and not obvious. And he did not know about these laws or this area of law at all. And he looked at us and he said, everybody knows what these laws are about. We just need to get the Supreme Court to actually see that. So, and that's kind of been our experience in the lower federal courts as well. So,
But not in the Eighth Circuit.
not in the Eighth Circuit. The Eighth Circuit was one of my rougher days in court.
Other questions? Come on.
I have a question. How do you see these suits as being like the strategic litigation against public participation, and then how does that fit in with like the anti-SLAPP laws, and how do those work together?
Well, sir, it's a great comparison. I mean, certainly these trespass claims and duty of loyalty claims. So the Food Line claim lawsuit I think is a classic SLAPP case. They did have a little bit stronger, common law legal ground. Although I still think the Fourth Circuit got it wrong. So I think they're in the same vein, and same with defamation, like using the tools of tort law and in some cases criminal law to basically punish and then deter people from engaging in important news gathering activity that reveals information about them they don't want the public to know. So, I think it's in some sense is a classic anti-SLAPP or it's classic SLAPP kind of litigation. So,
I wonder if it's worth taking just a second, given that Minnesota is an agricultural state, to think a little bit about this from the reverse. I mean, you're obviously focusing on why you think ag laws are unconstitutional and shouldn't exist, but maybe it's worth spelling out what the justification is for them singling out these particular industries for this additional level of protection that other industries would not have.
Right. So you could. The state would say, we need special laws for agriculture because they're the victims of these investigators, these rogue investigators who are roaming the country, taking secret videotapes and invading the privacy of their employees and committing trespass. So in their defense is it's not, so we've argued the fact that they're singling it out makes it obvious who the target is, which is the people who are advocating for animal rights. Their response is, no, they need special protection because the only reason the legislature adopted it for this industry is they're the ones who are suffering, right? The other thing about these cases,
But suffering in what way? Because,
yes,
you know, I'm thinking back to an old case that I used in my undergraduate mass comm law course called the Federal Beef Processing case, which involved an undercover investigation into a processing plant in South Dakota. And the argument that was made at the time was that if, I think it was CBS, were to broadcast the video that they had captured of these unsafe and unhygienic practices, that it would have an irreparably damage the economy of the state of South Dakota, because it would undermine the whole beef processing industry. Is that the argument that they're making?
it would be interesting if they made that argument. I think if you put a state legislator under a lie detector, that's what they would say the purpose is. But the agricultural industry actually makes what I thought you were going to say is, well, we can't have people taping because they're going to accidentally record a protected trade secret, right? And that's going to go to our competitors, and then we'll lose the intellectual property protection of the trade secrets laws.
Well, Federal Beef argued that too.
Yeah, well, they all argue that, and I think it's just smoke and mirrors. I mean, I don't know. There's never, there's not one single incident they could point to where an animal rights investigator accidentally recorded something that was involved in a trade secret, or that could be construed as a theft of a trade secret. So, I mean, it's really interesting that they really hang their hat on trespass a lot. And I keep pounding the table and saying, yes, it's a trespass, but there's no financial damage. So, how are we going to, what does Alvarez mean when it says legally cognizable harm? Right. Technically, yeah, but, and again, I think all of this comes back to, I guess the theme I'm coming back to tonight is they don't like the fact that they can't use defamation law, which is their main tool against journalists, and so they found other vehicles to do that.
And so the key is going to be to persuade, hopefully someday, the Supreme Court that the same kind of rationale that drove the protections from New York Times versus Sullivan ought to also apply in these kinds of news gathering contexts. I mean, is that
there needs to be some higher threshold, right? So, and because New York Times is unusual in that defamation is a generally applicable law, and yet there is an exception there. So it's not completely true that journalists are not cannot occasionally find where their interests are powerful enough an exemption from a generally applicable law.
Other questions? Do we have any from our online audience?
This is fascinating, but I do just want to have a clarifying question. I'm shocked that there's no other industry that doesn't have some sort of ag-gag law, right? So my research is all in the mining industry, and I can imagine they would love to have something like this.
Sure.
Is it because no investigative journalists have gotten into those industries, so the court cases haven't proceeded, or is it just they haven't been as successful as the agriculture industry in getting those gag laws in place?
It's a great question. I mean, I think that the ag legislation has all been reactive, right? It was reactive to some very high-profile investigations by the Humane Society and by other animal rights organizations, and who found just unwatchable video of the way that the animals were treated, and put them on YouTube. And then, the minute you put it on YouTube, then it becomes viral. Then millions of people are seeing it, and the secret that they want to keep from the public is out. So I think if a similar thing happened in the mining industry, you would see a very similar reaction. The North Carolina, we call it an ag law, but that applies to all industries. It's not just so. There's one example, but we got that declared unconstitutional in the Fourth Circuit. So. That applies to all employers, whatever. So it's a good question. And we've also pointed this out. If these are okay, then why not? You can't go undercover in a senior living facility and it's just to discover senior abuse, or a nursing home, right? Or a daycare facility to sort of, this is, I think I said this earlier. Now that since I've been doing this work, which for about the last 10 years, I see undercover investigations everywhere. I see them in the newspaper, I see them in popular media, or popular culture, I see them everywhere. But it's kind of true, like the ingenuity of the people who are trying to discover hidden facts is pretty amazing, and their persistent efforts to try to expose what they think is really unlawful things, and I think that's why they become popular on both ends of the political spectrum. I think why are they so popular? Because they work, right? They actually are. They can be shocking. They have. But not in a sensationalist way, but just to get people's attention to an important public issue. So, and I even am not sympathetic to the anti-abortion investigators or to Project Veritas, but if they adhered to these ethical principles, I would probably say that that's okay too. Now, again, arguably they're not, based on some of the allegations. So.
I actually did some undercover stuff in the early 90s, right about the same time
Yay.
as ABC.
You're my hero.
So my question is now, just listening to everything you said, like we were doing undercover stuff for every sweeps month for sure. And have these undercover investigations then scaled way back, I'm guessing, because of that risk? And what's the impact then when these things aren't uncovered, and should we be concerned about it?
So I think here's the last part of your question.
Well, I'm guessing there's many fewer undercover
yeah.
investigations happening now than there probably were in the early 90s. So what do we need to be concerned about? The impact of fewer things being potentially uncovered than they would have.
Yeah, I think that's inevitable, right? I think that is the loss. We don't really, we talk about the public value of the investigations, but Seth Stern at the Freedom of the Press Foundation wrote something where he said, "What are all the stories we don't even know about right now because of this?" And he and I both I pointed to Food Lion as really the turning point. And that was a case where the ultimate liability was 2 $1 verdicts against each of the producers, a nominal damages verdict. But of course, it cost ABC millions of dollars to defend that case. It took 4.5 years just to go to trial from the time the lawsuit was filed. And then it went on to the Fourth Circuit. And then I think Food Lion actually tried to take it to the Supreme Court. So it's just like defamation cases. It's not just the threat of the damages, it's the litigation costs. And as I've argued, that was ABC. What about a local television station or a public radio or public television station that doesn't have those kinds of resources? So I think the chill is even bigger, the more financially limited you are. So, they're always. ABC was one. I talked to Nathan Siegel, who's one of their lawyers in the Food Lion case, and I couldn't get out of him. I actually tried to get him to tell me exactly how much litigation costs. He said, "I think my client would not be happy if I told you that." And then he said, and this, I think I can say this. I said, "Have you completely shut down all undercover investigations at ABC and other?" And he works for other clients. He doesn't work for ABC anymore. But of all your clients, has Food Lion caused you to shut down all undercover investigations? And he said, "I don't think I can answer that question." So I think there are investigations going on, but I think that they're very careful about picking them out. I think they are, taking the ethical considerations seriously, and. I'll be interested to see if any of the major news outlets, especially the major TV news outlets, ever do a story with that kind of big national splash. I'd love to hear about your undercover work too. So.
I mean, I think one of the problems is, I mean, there's obviously the expense of this, because I remember when Food Lion was finally resolved, and I was writing columns for the American Journalism Review at the time, and I said, you know, the dancing in the streets really shouldn't happen, because ultimately there was liability. And even though the damages were small, you're still on the hook. And other news organizations need to be aware of that as well. And I think couple that now with the suspicion toward the mainstream or legacy media, and now it would be so easy to say perfectly accurately, they got this story by lying to get it, so why should you believe what they're telling you? It's a really dangerous time, I think, in that sense. Not so much legally, but in terms of the credibility of the press. So you have to weigh that factor, I think, very carefully in trying to do undercover investigations as well.
I think that's right, but I also think in some ways it's a time where undercover investigations could actually take the place of some of the losses we've had in the resources in the mainstream media. And this is a time where I hope that we'll hold government officials very accountable, and so sometimes that can only happen with undercover work.
So get out there and do your undercover work.
I'll be your lawyer.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Alan, for this really great talk and these great questions. And now I want to remind our in-person audience that we have copies of Alan's book for sale out in front, and we'd encourage you to pick one up and buy one, and he'd be happy to sign it for you and to continue this conversation. So thank you to everybody that was here tonight and who helped support tonight's event, and we'll be in touch about future Silha events. Thank you.
Thank you.